Solve the polynomial x cubed minus 3x squared minus x plus 3 equals 0. Here we are with office assistants Brooke and Sophia to tell us the latest on solving polynomials. When we solve polynomials, the first thing we want to do is set the equation equal to 0. If it's already set equal to 0, you can skip that. If it's not, you want to make sure that everything is moved to one side. Then you want to look to see if there are any greatest common factors that can be factored out. You want to check to see if all terms share a factor. Pull that biggest factor that they have shared, pull that out front, and then write what is left over inside parentheses. From there, you want to factor the polynomial. You may factor just the normal trinomial method, or you may have to do factor by grouping. Lastly, you're going to use what's called the zero product property. The zero product property says if you have two numbers, say A and B, being multiplied together, and that equals 0, we want to think, okay, what does that mean about A or B? Well, I know in order for something to equal 0 when I'm multiplying, I have to have one of those numbers be 0. So that means that A has to be 0 or B has to be 0. But that's the only way I get a 0 for an answer when I'm multiplying together, is if one of them is 0. So then we want to take this and we want to think, okay, what does that mean then? Is my A times B is 0. What if it's now 3x plus 2 times x plus 5 equaling 0? I still have two things being multiplied together and it equals 0. So just because now it doesn't look like it's just a number or a number that's 0, now we know that this whole thing has to be 0 or this whole thing has to be 0. So that's how we go about finishing solving a polynomial, is by using the concept that one of these must be 0. Thank you, Brooke and Sophia. Using those steps, we can now solve this polynomial. So the first thing, set it equal to 0. This one already is. Factor out any greatest common factors. This one does not have any greatest common factors that all four of these terms share. So now we're going to factor the polynomial. With this polynomial, because it has four terms, we're going to factor this by doing factor by grouping. So I want to set my polynomial, make it so it becomes two binomials. And now from here, I'm going to pull out what each of these binomials has in common. So this first binomial here, it has x cubed and then a negative 3x squared. Both of these share an x squared. I'm going to pull that out front. This is left with just an x. This one is left with a minus 3, so I pull that out front. Anytime I have a negative in front of my binomial, I want to make sure to pull that negative out front. Looking at the rest of this, it doesn't have anything else in common, so I'm just simply pulling a negative 1 out front here. What I have left then, this becomes a positive x. This becomes a negative 3, so I have x minus 3, and that is set equal to 0. My next step in my factor by grouping is to factor out the common binomial factor that these two terms share. So my x minus 3 is going to get pulled out front. So pulling out my x minus 3 in front, I'm going to now write what I have left over. This has an x squared left over. My second term has a negative 1 left over. So I have x minus 3 times x squared minus 1. I still have it equal to 0. However, this is not factored all the way. This is still a difference of squares. So I need to factor this a little bit further by taking the square root of x squared, by taking the square root of 1, and then writing it as the square root plus the square root minus the square root. So when I do that, I have x plus 1, x minus 1, and then my x minus 3 I have over here. Now that this is factored all the way, now I use the zero product property to finish my problem. The zero product property says that x plus 1 could equal 0, x minus 1 could equal 0, x minus 3 could equal 0. So I'm going to have all three of those set equal to 0. Now I need to solve by getting x by itself. I have to get rid of a plus 1 by minusing 1 on both sides. I have to get rid of my minus 1 by adding 1 on both sides. I have to get rid of my minus 3 by adding 3 on both sides. You can see me doing all three of those steps. Doing that, I'm going to be left with x minus 1, x plus 1, x equals minus 1, x equals 1, and x equals 3. My very last step is to write this as a solution set, so I have to go from smallest to largest with my numbers inside brackets. So my solution set is -1, 1, and 3.